Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kambiz Ranavardi. I'm a treasurer for Columbia Club of Washington, D.C., and a graduate of the School of Engineering and Applied Science. We are very lucky and privileged to have Dorothy Kronick, Associate Professor of Public Policy at Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley, and Professor John Polga-Hecimovich, Associate Professor of Political Science at the U.S. Naval Academy to help us understand Venezuela and talk about the current crisis. As for a really quick introduction, Professor Kronick um, focuses on contemporary Venezuela and the politics of crime and policing in Latin America. Her academic work and publications has been presented in top journals and publications such as the American Political Science Review, the Journal of Politics, Science, New York Times, Washington Post, and Caracas Chronicles. Also, before joining the faculty at Berkeley, Professor Kronick taught at University of Pennsylvania. She holds a PhD in political science from Stanford and also actually lived in Venezuela as a Fulbright scholar. And John Polga-Hecimovich focuses on the effects of political institutions on democratic stability, policymaking, and governance in Latin America. He has written widely about Venezuela and also is a co-author of a book just recently published, Authoritarian Consolidation in Times of Crisis, Venezuela under Nicolas Maduro. He has his MA in Latin American Studies from Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar in Ecuador and received his PhD in political science from University of Pittsburgh. Without further ado, I'll send it to you, John and Dorothy.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. So I think we're all here because of this big US military buildup in the Caribbean, right? Just yesterday, the United States seized an oil tanker carrying Venezuelan crude. And so I just want to start us out by asking why? Why is this happening and where might this be going? And, I think when we talk about why, it is tempting, but I think not super helpful to dismiss many plausible explanations. Like, is this about drugs? And then people say, well, no, Operation Southern Spear can't really be about drug overdose deaths, at least in the United States, because fentanyl doesn't come through Venezuela. Or, is it about regime change? And people say, well, no, because Trump campaigned against forever wars and Florida isn't even a swing state. Or, democracy and human rights. Well, yeah, that can't be it because no one cares about those things, right? And so on similarly for regional hegemony or oil and other plausible explanations. But then we're left wondering, how did we end up in this neocon scenario under a president who was all about no foreign entanglements, America first? And I think that the answer, rather than none of the above, is basically all of the above, or rather, at least one of the above for at least one person in the administration, right? So Trump, Rubio, Hegseth, Miller all have their own interests and objectives in this offensive. And I think it's that constellation of motives that maybe helps us make sense of the situation. Like we could, take Rubio, okay? So he's as the son of Cuban immigrants and Florida politician. Rubio has a strong personal and professional interest in toppling Maduro. So for him, I think if by some chance this ends with Maduro leaving power, that is obviously a huge win. And even if not, just being seen to go hard against Chavismo is a political win, even on its own, even if Maduro hangs on, right? And I think, Trump also, in a different way, is obviously super connected to South Florida. And actually, he made a point of telling Politico this past Monday that he owns the Doral Country Club, Doral being a city near Miami with lots of Venezuelans, and that he quote has got to know the Venezuelan people because he owns the country club, and yeah, something like they're unbelievable people. Everyone is successful. They're amazing. Um, they're incredible people. They've been tremendous to me, right? And so I don't think we should underestimate for both of them the allure of a shot, even a long shot, at being a hero at home, right? When you make your own people proud, that's worth 1,000 hits from Tucker Carlson, Laura Loomer, and other anti-hawk MAGA folks. And like similarly, you know, on thinking about drugs, even though this is not about reducing drug overdose deaths in the United States, I think Miller, and to some extent Trump as well, have an interest in a big show of force against drug trafficking, right? Showy counter-narcotics offensives. And Miller, I think also, you know, reportedly sees this offensive as part of a path to the expansion of presidential power domestically through promoting this narrative that, you know, we're under attack from dangerous narco-terrorist Venezuelans, at least, you know, according to some sources I were quoted it recently in the New Yorker. Then, as for this explanation of geopolitics and regional hegemony, countering China and Russia in the Western Hemisphere, I think it's relevant that these boat strikes on small boats in the Caribbean, have occurred alongside big, but I guess less visible investments in, for example, reopening the Roosevelt Roads Naval Station in Puerto Rico, and other signs of kind of long-term interest in military presence in Latin America, which suggests, to me at least, that this geopolitics is part of the story. Now, I will say, if anyone were interested in promoting democracy and human rights, hypothetically, there would obviously be very good reason to be concerned about what's going on in Venezuela. Part of how we got to where we are today is due to what happened in last year's presidential election in Venezuela. So I want to pause on that because I think it's really important context. So in Venezuela's presidential election last year, the opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez, backed by Maria Corina Machado, who received the Nobel Peace Prize this week, won in a landslide, defeating Maduro by a margin of 2-1. Maduro, of course, then falsely claimed that he won and obviously managed to stay in power. But what I want to emphasize is I sometimes see this misreported as a disputed election or a contested election, and that's really not a good gloss. You know, usually I think oppositions in authoritarian regimes do just have to say, well, we think this election was stolen. It seems like Putin committed fraud. But that's not what happened in this case. In Venezuela, Machado's team, the team of the opposition candidate, actually collected and presented evidence of the opposition victory, okay? And so this is the amazing thing about Venezuela's voting technology. So you cast your vote on a touchscreen, then the machine prints out an individual paper ticket recording your vote, and you put that ticket in a box. And then at the end of the day, two things happen. First, a decent sized sample of those boxes are opened and the tickets are counted in the presence of opposition witnesses in many places. And two, each voting machine prints a long paper tally sheet, the acta, and copies with the vote totals from that machine. And copies of the acta are given not only to the witnesses for each candidate, but also to all the poll workers. And so then what did the Gonzalez campaign do? They organized this incredible team, mostly of volunteers, to collect and scan these tally sheets, the actas. This was an unbelievable logistical effort with runners and roll scanners in secret locations, right? And they then built an app that the team could use to digitize and organize the data from the tally sheets in a spreadsheet. And then they built a website and published these tally sheets and the spreadsheet online 2 days after the election, right? And that's how they showed the world, not just that they suspected fraud, but that Maduro did commit fraud. And for me, what's amazing is this same technology that proved and validated Hugo Chavez's electoral victories in many previous elections was last year used by the opposition to prove and validate the opposition victory. This whole effort was just really so astonishing and so beautiful. The US journalist Nancy Updike described it as a mass act of civil obedience. And I think that's such a good way of describing it, a mass act of civil obedience. And then, of course, the election was followed by a horrific wave of repression with hundreds of arrests, disappearances, and deaths in custody, right? And so, to my point about all of the above, obviously correcting these injustices and violations of Venezuelans' political rights and other human rights is not at the top of the agenda of the Trump administration. But that background, I think, does at the very least change how this effort can be marketed and how some folks feel about it. So I guess this is all to say, I don't think it makes sense to think about what the administration or the Trump administration has in mind with this offensive, because actually there are many actors with many different goals. And I think that kind of potpourri constellation aspect of it is really important to thinking through what happens next or what might happen next. Because, when I think about where we might be headed, at one end of the spectrum, a few days ago, there was a piece in the New York Times, an opinion piece, that was basically saying, well, Trump picked this fight with Maduro, and so he can't back down. He won't back down. He can't lose the staring contest with Maduro, right? And so the implication being that we're headed toward more military strikes, maybe on remote airstrips in Venezuela used for cocaine smuggling, maybe on Venezuelan military installations, or maybe, and perhaps the seizure of the oil tanker yesterday is a sign of this, maybe the administration is pivoting to kind of a economic blockade type strategy where it's starving the country and the administration of cash flows, right? And so that idea that we're definitely headed toward escalation may be right. It could very well be right. It's not unlikely. But I think it is also possible, it is totally possible that Trump will go in a different direction and de-escalate, or I think of it more as like escalate to negotiate strategy that involves eventually switching to the track preferred by Special Envoy Rick Grenell, meaning declare victory on drug trafficking and then work with Maduro to get US oil companies and other corporate interests back into Venezuela. And I think that's possible in part because military intervention is very unpopular with US voters and is getting more pushback from Congress as well. And then, on the Maduro government side, there's a similar indeterminacy, right? Where we don't know. The military might or might not decide that it's time to replace Maduro, maybe or maybe not with another Chavista. Now, John, my co-panelist who's about to talk, has done some great and like truly chilling work on how Maduro cemented control over the Venezuelan armed forces. So I'm going to let him talk about that and those probabilities. I think my takeaway from that work, and also from just thinking through the difficulty of offering credible guarantees, meaning guarantees of amnesty or protection from prosecution to members of the Venezuelan armed forces who've committed major human rights abuses. My takeaway is that, unfortunately, it's not unlikely that Maduro will stay in power, right? And I will say also, one kind of disorienting consequence of this situation, just on a personal note, is that many of us researchers who spent so many years researching and documenting the causes and consequences of Chavismo are suddenly studying the causes and consequences of this maximum pressure strategy, right? So I've worked on the past Venezuelan elections, media censorship, police violence in Venezuela, And now I found myself suddenly working on a quantitative project about the Venezuelans who were sent from the United States to Secot, a maximum security prison in El Salvador. And likewise, I have a brilliant co-author, an economist who, among many other things, was the first to estimate the effects of Hugo Chavez's big social programs, the misiones. And he showed that these big, then very popular programs actually did not increase human capital, meaning they didn't actually do a lot for education or health status, right? And that co-author is now working on estimating the effects of US sanctions on the Venezuelan economy. And so at our conferences, we have these academic debates about what percent of the Venezuelan economic collapse is due to sanctions or how many excess debts. These are not the debates that we want to be having. So I will just say, I am hoping that my next project is not about consequences of an economic blockade and instead about studying vote choice in, a free and fair Venezuelan election. Okay, before I pass this to John, I just want to say one other thing, which is that journalists reporting on this issue, and by this issue, I mean the Maduro government, repression in Venezuela, and the US government and US strategy, journalists are working under very difficult conditions, right? Most importantly, by far, state repression and hostility, which of course is the main challenge, but also a social media environment and just social environment in which any reporter who, might question the wisdom of US military action in Venezuela or even quote someone questioning that wisdom is automatically accused of being on Maduro's payroll. And likewise, reporters who wonder, well, actually, is there a role for the United States in this situation? And are there examples of the US promoting democracy in Latin America in the past? Those reporters are automatically, that person is a fascist imperial lackey, right? And so but despite all of these challenges, I have been reading such informative reporting, like both from major US news outlets and amazingly to me, from Venezuelan journalists working in Venezuela on, investigative pieces on these Venezuelans who were sent to Secot, articles that somehow, have sources in the Trump administration, in the Maduro government, work tracking the victims of these boat strikes, also just helping readers understand the international drug smuggling industry. So I promised John I was going to end on a positive note. And so I will just say, if there are any journalists on this call, you give me hope. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dorothy. That was wonderful. That was a great overview of everything. I'm going to focus on, as you said, probably the military and maybe what some chances of a transition are, what transitions would look like, regime transitions, and what some challenges might be in a post-Maduro world. So I'm just going to begin by saying I'm so happy to be here with all of you this evening, this chilly evening here in Washington, D.C. So the dispatch of warships to the Caribbean and the lethal use of force mark a return to a hard power approach that has largely receded from Latin America since the Cold War. And you could even make the argument that in some respects, recent strikes are more evocative of the late 19th and early 20th centuries than they are even of the Cold War era. But certainly this show of force, this military presence, represents an attempt to unsettle Nicolás Maduro and his inner circle in Venezuela to try and provoke a coup d'etat, right? Or to force otherwise regime change, pushing him to seek a hasty retreat, right? The idea, I think, is to lead to redemocratization and a government headed by the opposition, which rightfully won the elections in 2024. The logic from the Trump administration's perspective, I think, is more or less the following, and it follows echoes a lot of what Dorothy just said, and that's that Secretary of State Rubio and his team see Maduro as an ideological enemy who must be removed. Well, a different faction of the U.S. government believes, at least rhetorically, that Venezuela is a major narcotics threat to the United States, which we also know is pretty erroneous. Nonetheless, it's being used as pretext for this pressure campaign. So I guess the real question is, how in the world has this unpopular dictator remained in power for so long in Venezuela? What has he done, or what hasn't he done? Why has it been so difficult for the Venezuelan opposition to remove him? Because he's incredibly unpopular in Venezuela, right? Let alone among members of the diaspora. And there has been a pressure campaign to remove him from outside of Venezuela, beginning in at least 2019. So how has he survived? And the answer to that question is that he's managed to coup-proof his regime. Coup-proofing is this idea that there are strategies leaders undertake to reduce two things. Firstly, coup attempts. So simply, they discourage officers from even attempting to remove the sitting leader. And the second thing they do is they decrease the likelihood of success if a coup is attempted, right? In the case of Maduro, he followed someone, Hugo Chavez, who ruled the country from 1999 to 2013, and was an ex-military officer himself and commanded almost the complete loyalty of the armed forces. And the people who didn't follow him, he purged. So he was able to build this very loyal apparatus to protect him, especially after a failed coup attempt in April of 2002. Maduro, however, came to power as oil prices had declined. He was much weaker. Venezuela was already in the throes of an economic crisis that his policies would exacerbate, right, leading to the massive migration of some 8 million Venezuelans. And so he was confronted with, almost immediately after assuming power in 2013, with the challenge of trying to muddle through. And what he has done is, I think he's been underestimated by the opposition. He's been underestimated by foreign governments. And he has proven himself to be a pretty agile political operator, or a survivor at the very least. And I would say he has done 4 major things to make it difficult to get rid of him. The first of these is that he has privatized public assets in Venezuela. He has transferred sectors of the economy, state-owned enterprises and things like that, to senior members of the military. This is in agriculture, in mining, in petroleum, in banking even. Okay. He's transferred control of state-owned companies, ports, food distribution, medicine distribution, etc. He's also allowed members of the armed forces to participate in illicit economies. And that means certainly drug trafficking, but it also means illegal gold mining and mining of other precious metals in eastern Venezuela, the trafficking of foodstuffs and medicines, and on down the line. So he has found a way to muddle through economic crisis by using other sources of income to placate senior officers, right? The second thing he's done is manipulated personnel, right? So he's purged perceived disloyal officers. He has given mass promotions to loyalists, and he has retained his allies in power. And like I said before, Hugo Chavez did some of this purging of people he considered to be disloyal, but Maduro has accelerated it, and he's even jailed, imprisoned some of them in a torture center in Caracas, right? And several of them have died. So that discourages other acts of disloyalty speaking out from members of the armed forces. At the same time, he has averaged something like, well, he's promoted 2,300 officers to the rank of general or admiral between 2013 and 2025. Now, I don't know what that the annual average is for that. But 2,300 promotions to that rank compares to a total of 906 flag officers in the entire United States military, right? So in the United States, we think of it as, and there have been criticisms that it's a top-heavy force in the United States. The Venezuelan armed forces is incredibly top-heavy, and teeters, in fact, because those types of promotions are also a way to purchase loyalty. And lastly, you have a Minister of Defense, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, who has been Minister of Defense since October 2014. So we're going on, more than 11 years as Minister of Defense, when each Minister of Defense between Chavez coming to power in 1999 and Maduro in 2013 served an average of 11 months in power, right? So, I mean, he served 10 times more than the average minister prior to him. And so he is part and parcel of this administration. I think that is important also to recognize. In the press, it's easy to use shorthand and say, let's get rid of Maduro. But this is a regime. It is not just an administration. And a regime means that there is a particular logic of governance, right? And a logic of power. And so removing a single individual does not break a regime. It would need to be a question of removing many individuals from that government. And I think that's something very important to bear in mind. Maduro has also done something called counterbalancing, which is creating parallel security forces that pose a threat to anyone who might overthrow him. He has doubled down on something called the Bolivarian militia, which are civilians that the government arms and kind of trains. The Venezuelan government's claim there are 5 to 8 million members of the Bolivarian militia. I think it's probably closer to like 1 or 1.5 million. Right. But nonetheless, something pretty significant that poses a possible threat to Maduro opponents, because these people are more ideologically tied to the government than the average Venezuelan. There are also collectives which are essentially, they have emerged out of a very interesting milieu of groups that have been engaged in politics, left-wing politics. But today, kind of this third generation of collectives that exist in the country are armed paramilitary groups that are again tied to the government. And there are other non-state armed actors that are also tied to the regime that are very important for governance. And so these parallel forces provide a counterbalance to any potential anti-government activity. And lastly, the government has whether intentionally or not, created coordination problems, making a coup incredibly difficult, right? And they've done so through, first of all, strategically placing military counterintelligence and Cuban counterintelligence agents into the military, so that coordination among the junior ranks is very, very difficult because there are informants all over. And secondly, through these promotions, having promoted 2,300 junior officers to the rank of admiral or general, they have created jurisdictional redundancies, which means it's never very clear to junior officers who's in charge of any given theater of operation. And so planning a coup, which requires a great deal of coordination, becomes nearly impossible, right? I think there's a lot of evidence that this has been successful. I mean, he survived, which is evidence. But there have been several mutinies that emerged at lower levels that never kind of transcended that. And they never turned into true coup attempts. I count like something like 8 or 9 between 2017 and 2020. So I think that this is important to understand. This is a government and a regime that is incredibly resilient, and that is what the United States has decided to put itself up against, right? So let's just say, because I've already spoken a lot, what happens if Maduro is removed? What if he falls? And that is, I'm sure we'd be happy to answer questions about the probabilities about what we think might happen, some logical scenarios, and will he or won't he fall? But what happens if Maduro and the rest of the regime is removed? And I think nearly any outcome is possible. I think there is a full range of possible outcomes, from what opposition figures have been saying in the international press, which is a return to democracy and the government that, rightfully and justifiably won the 2024 elections, all the way down to greater dictatorship, which is to say a military junta running the country, or civil conflict, right? I think probably the truth lies somewhere in between. I think governance is going to be quite difficult because there are a lot of challenges in a post-Maduro Venezuela, because so many state institutions have been politicized, the military is highly politicized, and will be needed to enforce the rule of law and reassert stateness across national territory. So, my fear, and I have no inside information about this, I'm just reading what journalists have written. My fear is that there's been much more effort put into figuring out how to remove Maduro, and much less efforts into figuring out how post-Maduro governance would actually work, right? And how state construction and reconstruction would take place. The post-transition challenges include this proliferation, right? The panoply of non-state armed actors that exist. And I think the real possibility of a low-intensity conflict. So, these groups include Colombian guerrillas, the ELN, and non-demobilized FARC guerrillas that don't just live in border areas, but in fact across Venezuela's south and into its eastern region, far away from Colombia. There are wildcat miners that have organized into gang-like structures in eastern Venezuela. There are these paramilitary collectives in urban areas. There's the militia. And so I think a big question for me is, what happens to those groups if there is a transition? Do those groups immediately decide to reject their allegiance to Madurismo, Nicolas Maduro and his ideology? Or do they actually reconsider, or do they engage in violence? Do they, because they are part of the civilian population, do they continue to be essentially disguised as civilians and yet engage in a type of guerrilla warfare? I don't think anyone quite knows the answer to those questions right now, but I think it behooves us to do so. There is a war game exercise that the Pentagon carried out in 2019, and that concluded that these groups would fill the leadership void left by the fall of the regime. That would require a long-term commitment from the United States. And I mean, not just security cooperation, but probably the boots on the ground that the Trump administration wants to avoid, right? It requires an incredible amount of regional cooperation between Colombia and Brazil and other neighboring countries, intelligence sharing, border fortification, all these sorts of things. So, I think that would probably anger the MAGA base here in the United States. How am I doing time-wise? Do I have 2 more minutes, maybe?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So, with that in mind, I think to build off of one thing Dorothy said, and then I will obviously be happy to answer as many questions as you have. This conflict, I think, very neatly aligns with the Trump administration's new national security strategy. The national security strategy narrows the U.S.'s purpose to, quote, core national interests, end quote. And it explicitly disavows the post-Cold War liberal order that the U.S. built and led. And so this suggests unilateralism. And so far, the United States has acted pretty unilaterally in Venezuela, and other countries like Colombia have criticized the U.S., but there's been limited pushback. Others like Guyana or Trinidad and Tobago have remained silent or kind of acquiesced to what the U.S. has asked. So I think that's very important to understand. The national security strategy elevates immigration to a central national security problem. In that sense, Venezuela, it checks a box for the U.S. And the so-called Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine puts the Western Hemisphere first and implies the realignment of global force posture. And so in that sense, controlling immigration flows, combating transnational organized crime, preventing non-hemispheric competitors from gaining control over strategic positions and assets are all plausible explanations for U.S. action. And I have read a lot about and spoken to plenty of people who have suggested that the United States move in the USS Gerald Ford aircraft carrier from Europe to the Caribbean has to be temporary. And the US has to do something so it can justify the aircraft carrier. And I don't think that's true. Dorothy and I were talking before, and I said the aircraft carrier was off the coast of Croatia and then off the coast of Norway. It's achieving the same objectives or maybe more in the Caribbean, right, compared to what it was achieving before. And it is an illustration. It's a very kind of tangible illustration of U.S. power, right? This kind of big stick type of power, and a warning to extra hemispheric actors. So I'm not sure that this is temporary. And honestly, I think there are lots of indications that Venezuela is not unique in corralling U.S. interests, that countries like Colombia and Panama and even Mexico could also be targets of U.S. policy, to put it euphemistically. And I think lastly, the tanker seizure that we saw yesterday is a continuation of what so far some pro-administration spokespersons have called it the strategic ambiguity of the Trump administration in the Western Hemisphere. I probably would characterize it differently. It seems to me to be a continuation of throw everything against the wall and see what sticks. And so it represents a pivot if from a previous action. So I think everyone here tonight, if you're interested in trying to understand what's going on and what's going to happen in the future, pay attention to the tanker seizures. If this was a one-off event, then we can see things suggesting terrestrial strikes or nothing. But if there is another ghost tanker that is seized, then I think this indicates a policy pivot and an attempt to choke off the administration, the regime in Venezuela. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John and Dorothy. And I apologize again for my voice. Lots of questions, so please keep them coming. We covered as many of them until 7:30 local time. So maybe I start with, not in order, but I start with basic questions such as, do you see any possibility of any effective international opposition for countries such as Brazil, China, or even Russia in the current U.S. pressure campaign?
John, why don't you start on that one?
I think that it's been quite amazing to see how countries like Russia and China and other erstwhile allies have not jumped to Venezuela's defense right now. Something that Maduro had, I think, counted on. Russia right now, they sent a transport there a month or so ago with spare parts for the military vehicles. But otherwise, Russia hasn't been too involved because it is otherwise preoccupied with what's going on in Ukraine, with their own invasion of Ukraine, right? Cuba has done all that it can with sending intelligence agents in the military, and that is documented. I have documented that. China is interested in getting paid. China has not a ton of interest in who really is governing Venezuela, as long as China gets the money that it's owed from the $70 billion that it lent Venezuela. And Iran also has weaker links to Venezuela than is often portrayed in the press. And so I think the role of Venezuela's erstwhile authoritarian allies is pretty weak.
Anything to add, Dorothy?
Yeah, sure. Should I can I pull another question for the chat, or did you
No,
want
no,
to?
no. If you want to add anything
No,
to
no, I
John's
agree with
response.
John. I mean, while we're on the topic of the international community, I just think it's interesting thinking about Latin America, which countries recognized Edmundo Gonzalez's victory in last year's presidential election. And I think it was, and which is different from, so the United States recognized Edmundo Gonzalez as the winner, which is not like recognizing him as the president of Venezuela, as the Trump administration did in 2019 with Juan Guaido, which is something totally different with major political and economic implications, but just recognizing that Gonzalez won. And I think that's something that many people were looking for last year from Brazil, from Colombia, and they expressed some concerns about the election, but kind of stopped short of that recognition that I think many people hoped for.
Okay, thank you. There is a question from Gabrielle Vetter Taafi. Hopefully I'm pronouncing correctly. Can you confirm that the reason given, drug cartels, are they basically does any of this activity have any impact on the U.S. or well, maybe in another way to put it, is this argument just only a pretext that drugs are not really a point of contention?
Yeah, I think the short answer to Gabrielle's question is yes. It is a pretext, and Trinidad is not perpetrating an invasion or incursion of the United States, is not a military, well, John's the military expert, but I'm guessing he would agree, Trinidad, which the experts on this organization suggest is a gang of maybe 5,000 members. So this is not a military threat to the United States. I think that's correct. Yeah.
I think that's a wonderful question that we probably should have clarified more I should have clarified more. I agree 100% with Dorothy. There are two groups that the Trump administration, at the behest of Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Corina Machado, that the administration has claimed are headed by Nicolas Maduro and the Venezuelan government, and they are quote unquote narco-terrorists. And that is Tren de Aragua, which, like Dorothy just said, is a street gang. And it's a transnational street gang that certainly is violent and brutal and cruel and engages in human trafficking and micro narco trafficking, but does so on the Chilean-Bolivian border and in Lima, Peru, and in parts of Colombia, but not even Bogota, because the gang is not strong enough to have a presence in Bogota, because the gangs in Bogota are stronger. So the idea that the United States has been invaded by Tren de Aragua, I think, has very minimal evidence. Likewise, any relationship between the Nicolas Maduro administration and Tren de Aragua is unsubstantiated at best. And so I think that is important to know. And lastly, Tren de Aragua is not known to really engage in trafficking from Venezuela to other countries, let alone fentanyl, which doesn't come from Venezuela. So there are like a whole host of claims there that are very difficult to substantiate. There is another group that the Trump administration has tied to narco-terrorism, which is the so-called Cartel de los Soles, which means the Cartel of the Suns, which is this wonderful, evocative name. And it refers to the sun insignias on National Guard members' uniforms. And it was coined by Venezuelan journalists in the 1990s, before any of these Chavistas, right, Chavez and Maduro and everyone else came to power. And it was kind of a joke, right? Because it referred to the trafficking that took place, and in fact, competition between junior officers in the military, in the army, and junior officers in the National Guard, which competed for these narco trafficking routes. Chavez turned a blind eye to this trafficking, as has Maduro. But which is to say, narco trafficking exists, and it helps support the regime insofar as it provides illicit income to military officers, undeniably. But it is not a centralized cartel the way we think of the, Juarez cartel in Mexico, or the Sinaloa cartel, or what the Medellin cartel was in the 1990s in Colombia. It's a completely different thing. It's a diffuse network of traffickers. And the idea that this is being headed and controlled by Maduro, I think also is quite unsubstantiated. So maybe that's now more of an answer than you're hoping for, but certainly the claim that this is about drugs has not a lot of evidence behind it.
Well, thank you both. So let me briefly switch to domestic. There are two questions. I'll ask them maybe at the same time. Maybe you guys can chime in. One is, do you think this administration has enough leverage to start a war without congressional approval? And there's another question for domestic support, which is, they refer, the question is from Gabrielle again. The questioner refers to El Doral neighborhood in Miami, the annulment of temporary protection status of Venezuelans there, and possibly unpopularity of the war in Venezuela, or this administration's opposition to Maduro. Can you tell us the drivers domestically for and against this war?
Yes, thanks for these great questions. So let me start with the question about TPS and Venezuelans or Venezuelan Americans' political attitudes in the United States, because I think while it's true that Doral was one of the areas that kind of really has swung to the right in recent years, the support of Venezuelans in the United States and even of Venezuelan voters, which is a fraction of the hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans in the United States, for Trump I think is massively overstated. Not least, of course, by Trump himself, who in his interview with Politico on Monday said that they voted for me 94%. That is not true. In fact, with some colleagues, we have a project looking at voter registration of Venezuelans in Florida and elsewhere, and this is just not true. We're still making progress, but I do think, people talk a lot about Magazuela, which is this idea that, Venezuelans really support Trump. And again, there's some truth to that, but I think it's overstated. And this is a place where I think research can really help us learn more. So we're actually applying for grants and funding to do more surveys of Venezuelans in the United States and try to understand more about their political attitudes. And certainly I share Gabrielle, right? Gabrielle's intuition that ending TPS it's tremendously unpopular and has certainly changed a lot of political attitudes. I will also say, just anecdotally, not based on research, I think many Venezuelans in the United States see and have talked publicly about ways in which Trump resembles Chavez and are very alarmed by that and really, firmly have democratic values and are concerned about the strength of democracy. So I think that's another important thing to recognize as well. And yes, as for war without congressional approval, I'll pass that to John.
No. I work for the federal government and I love my job.
Actually, there was a question, saying that, do you feel safe? We haven't forced you to do this, right?
No one's forced me to do this. I'm doing this in a private capacity. I am a Naval Academy professor, but I'm doing this in my private capacity. And the views that I have given here are my own and not those of the U.S. Naval Academy, the Department of the Navy, or the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. So without congressional approval, let me say, without answering your question, the way a politician would, they would answer what they want to talk about rather than actually answering the question. And so as if I were a politician, I'll answer your question by saying, I don't think the United States is really considering any invasion. I think the chances of an invasion are minuscule, like low single digits, if that. I mean, really, really low. And the reason, there are so many reasons why that is. I think if the United States acts as to use, mill speak, kinetically, right, it would be through targeted strikes, terrestrial strikes in Venezuela, striking infrastructure that is critical to the military, or camps that it can tie to Colombian guerrillas, and therefore give justification, right, and claim victory that the United States achieved something, and thus give the Trump administration a less inelegant, not more elegant, less inelegant exit strategy from Venezuela and from the conflict. That would be a way that I can see the Trump administration backing down. I could even see, Dorothy and I have talked about this prior to today, negotiations that end with Maduro letting the Trump administration bomb something in Venezuela in exchange for allowing him to stay in power, and allowing each side to claim victory. So I think there's so many different possibilities on the table, especially when each leader has proven to be so transactional and willing to pivot ideologically on a dime. Do you see how I didn't answer the question? I didn't answer the question with a long answer.
That was perfect. Let me ask you, actually, this is an intriguing question, Anonymous. I guess the idea is that U.S. Troop concentration over there makes some people think, I guess, do you think is it possible that any escalation path would include U.S. to seize the Panama Canal with the forces that they have in the area for whatever reason? Maybe a payback to China, or if the Venezuela tankers move to put a chokehold on Latin America. Do you think that that's a possibility?
This is, again, I would defer to John, but my instinct would be no. I don't see the U.S. military seizing the Panama Canal. I mean, I'm not sure what the advantages of that would be, given, Panama working with the administration on many issues. Like, what would be the upside? And I think, of course, it'd be very costly, and the canal is vulnerable to sabotage. And I don't see that. But John, what do you think?
In President Trump's inaugural address on January 20th, 2025, he stated that the United States would, quote, take back the Panama Canal from Panama. And I don't see any reason to not take the president at his word with regards to this. Will it happen? I can't say. Would President Trump like that? I think so. Yeah. So I
Wow.
don't share maybe completely your interpretation, Dorothy. Yeah.
The more disagreement, that makes for a better event.
Absolutely. Maybe I have a question. Being also originally from Middle East, do you think that just putting Afghan's war, 20 years of U.S. presence, multiple, I think, $2.3 trillion expenditure in this roughly 20 years, that by far the majority of it did not go and elevate the lives of Afghans. Do you think there is any lesson, or maybe I'll put it this way: do you think there is any impact on the support that Maduro gets from poor rural Venezuelans to support the U.S. potential invasion?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first thing I would say is that while Maduro is abysmally unpopular, I do think this has given him a little boost in the polls. There's a little bit of a rally around the flag effect. And I think that's real. And I would also say, thinking about kind of historical parallels in terms of US intervention, people who are advocating for US military intervention in Venezuela often point to Panama and say, well, look at this case where the US military liberated Panama from a drug dealing dictator and it was so costless and worked out so well. And I think that is a very misleading parallel. In part because it was, I think, as a Venezuelan journalist put it at one point, like Panama was pre-invaded. We already had the canal, we already had major US presence. And beyond that, we landed, what was it, John? Like 25,000 troops, 20, right? Boots on the ground against, I don't know, 10,000 Panamanian defense forces, right? And even so, the fighting kind of dragged on. Hundreds of Panamanians were killed. We lost, US service members. Obviously the conditions in Venezuela are much more challenging. So yeah, that's what's coming to mind for me.
Venezuela is a mountainous country with jungles and all sorts of places to hide and engage in guerrilla warfare. It is however many times larger, 20 times larger than Panama or whatever. It is an incredibly imperfect analog. And so there's certainly one of the questions asked how an invasion what an invasion would look like. Could you invade from an aircraft carrier? No, there are certainly not enough military personnel in the Caribbean right now to engage in an actual invasion. And which is why I say that I think this is not really truly on the table. I think it's a bluff. I think what the Trump administration would like is a costless regime change, or a relatively costless regime change without risking putting US lives at risk, and without risking long-term rebuilding of the country or attempts at rebuilding, looking at Afghanistan. And an invasion does not kind of conform to either of those expectations.
Okay, and maybe one last question. We can't get to all of them, but from Elliot Wolf, asking, what is the status of a Chevron license to support the Venezuela oil company and the Caribbean islands dependent on Venezuela oil?
Dorothy, what do you know about the Chevron license?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think so this is just for background for other people other than Elliot. This has been, the Trump administration has gone back and forth on this issue over the last year of should Chevron have this special license to continue operating in Venezuela, right? And Rick Grinnell, special envoy, was kind of taking the lead in advocating for it, and then the administration pulled back. And currently, I believe the current status is that there's a restricted license. Is that your understanding, John? Yeah. And so this has been a major also political flashpoint, and Laura Loomer has talked about this. And so this is kind of a big part of that controversy within the administration. And so I will come back to the point that I started with, which is that different people in the government have different objectives and are not necessarily aligned. And that's, I think, really important to understanding why there's been this kind of indeterminacy and fluctuation in the strategy.
Thank you. So we have time for final remark from both of you. Any suggestions, reading suggestions? John, I think your book is obviously one suggestion for people to read.
Oh, I'm so bad at promotion, aren't I?
Well,
I
here
should
you
mention
go.
something. Yeah.
Any final comment?
Oh, yeah. Let me go. Dorothy, talk. I'm going to go get my book. Give me a.
Yeah, go get your book. Well, I certainly recommend all of John's work. And yeah, I guess one of the recommendation is, I think if you're going to be following people, Phil Gunson, I think, has been in Venezuela for a long time. He was the Economist correspondent, and he's been very smart on a bunch of issues. And I guess I would just say, again, I think while of course I could quibble with certain misrepresentations and mistakes in the press, like overall, the reporting on these issues, I think, has been really impressive, exactly in debunking many of the Maduro administration's propaganda and claims, and debunking false claims from the Trump administration as well.
I have no idea what you said because I just got back. I'm sure it was brilliant, though. I have this book, and I chose the cover: Authoritarian Consolidation in Times of Crisis, Venezuela under Nicolás Maduro. And the cover has Maduro, it has Vladimir Padrino Lopez, the defense minister, and it has, excuse me, that's Diosdado Cabello and Vladimir Padrino Lopez. Diosdado Cabello is another key figure, and so these are the figures that essentially are the tripod upon which the regime rests. And so, yeah, it's not very often that one gets to actually promote an academic book that is relevant to kind of current dynamics. I just want to thank, I want to thank Dorothy for all that she had to say today. I really appreciate it. I want to thank all of you for showing up today as well and listening to us. And let's hope for a peaceful resolution down with the dictatorship in Venezuela. Hopefully no lives are lost. Hopefully there is a transition to democracy, and I will get to go back to Venezuela next Christmas like I used to play dominoes and be with my in-laws.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. Thank you, John, and looking forward to future, maybe more hopeful presentations on this topic.
Thank you so much.